November 27, 1944. Omura Air Arsenal, Kyushu, Japan. Captain Katsuo Tomita's boots crunched across frosted grass as he approached the massive shape sitting on the tarmac, its aluminum skin gleaming under weak morning sun. Around him, a crowd of engineers, mechanics, and senior officers stood in absolute silence, staring at what shouldn't exist on Japanese soil. A Boeing B-29 Superfortress, intact. Flyable? Impossible. The aircraft had belly landed near Vladivostok after a raid on Manchuria, interned by the Soviets, then quietly handed over to their Japanese allies through channels that officially didn't exist. Now it sat like a cathedral of American industrial might, dwarfing every Japanese bomber on the field. Tomita had flown nearly every aircraft in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service inventory. He had commanded bomber squadrons over China, tested prototypes at Tachikawa, and written tactical doctrine for the Army Aviation Bureau. But standing beneath this machine's wing, which stretched wider than his entire G-4M bomber's length, he felt something he'd never experienced in 20 years of flying. Inadequacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Captain Tomita didn't know, what none of the assembled experts could yet comprehend, was that this captured aircraft would shatter every assumption Japanese aviation had built over a decade of war. Within 6 weeks, Japanese test pilots would discover that the B-29's operational range exceeded anything in their arsenal by over 2,000 miles. They would learn that its service ceiling made it nearly invulnerable to interception. Most devastating of all, they would realize that this wasn't cutting-edge American technology. This was America's standard production bomber, rolling off assembly lines at the rate of 150 per month, while Japan struggled to produce 30 bombers of any type. The B-29 would prove to be more than an aircraft. It was a mathematical proof of defeat, a flying demonstration that the war had been unwinnable from the moment it began. And the Japanese pilots who flew it, who pushed its throttles forward and felt its power, would understand with perfect clarity why their cities were burning and why no amount of courage or skill could stop what was coming. The numbers they would discover in its cockpit would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Cold equations that spelled the end of an empire. The empire's blind spot. To understand what the captured B-29 revealed, you must first understand what Japanese aviation had convinced itself was true. Since the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, Japanese bomber doctrine had evolved around a simple premise. Strategic bombing required range, but range required sacrifice. You could build bombers that flew far, or bombers that carried heavy loads, or bombers that defended themselves. But you couldn't have all three. Physics wouldn't allow it. The Mitsubishi G-3M bomber, nicknamed Nell by the Allies, epitomized this philosophy. It could reach targets 1,300 miles away, an impressive range in the late 1930s. But to achieve this, designers had stripped away everything deemed non-essential. No armor plating protected the crew. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. The bomb load maxed out at 1,760 pounds. Defensive armament consisted of 3 machine guns that might as well have been passengers given their effectiveness. When American fighters discovered that a single burst could turn a G-3M into a fireball, Allied pilots coined their own nickname for it, the one-shot lighter, the Flying Zippo. The Type 1 honorable flaming coffin, depending on which squadron you asked. Japanese crews called it something unprintable in official reports, but universally understood in ready rooms across the Pacific. The G-4M Betty bomber, introduced in 1941, represented an attempt to address these vulnerabilities while maintaining range. It could fly 2,600 miles and carry 2,200 pounds of bombs. Designers added rubber coating to fuel tanks, attempting to create self-sealing capability without the weight penalty of American systems. They installed a 4th machine gun. They even added a tail cannon, but the fundamental compromise remained. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, who had flown Bettys against American shipping in the Solomons, described the experience in his recovered diary with bitter precision. Flying the G-4M is flying a fuel tank with wings. We carry 6,260 gallons, distributed through tanks woven throughout the fuselage and wings. One tracer round in the wrong place and 20 men die screaming. The Americans call us Betty. We call them flying coffins. Both names are accurate. The strategic miscalculation went deeper than individual aircraft design. Japanese military planners had based their entire Pacific strategy on a fundamental assumption about American industrial capacity and will. They believed America, despite its massive economy, couldn't project power across the Pacific's vast distances. The ocean itself would be Japan's defense. By the time American forces fought their way across thousands of miles of water, Japan would have fortified the inner empire so thoroughly that the cost of invasion would break American resolve. This assumption required one critical condition: that American bombers couldn't reach the Japanese homeland from any base they were likely to capture. In 1941, this seemed mathematically certain. The best American heavy bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, had a combat radius of roughly 800 miles. Even if America captured islands like Saipan or Tinian, they were 1,500 miles from Tokyo. The math was simple. American bombers couldn't reach Japan. Therefore, Japan was safe. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, chief of the Army General Staff's Operations Section, had written this calculation into Japan's strategic planning documents in 1940. The Pacific's distances guarantee our security. The Americans may win battles, but geography makes winning the war impossible. They cannot bomb what they cannot reach, and they cannot reach the homeland from any base their logistics can support. This confidence wasn't arrogance born of ignorance, it was mathematics verified by every available intelligence estimate. Japanese naval attachés in Washington had reported on American bomber development throughout the late 1930s. They knew about Boeing's experimental long-range bomber projects. They knew the theoretical specifications, but they also knew the immense gulf between theoretical design and operational reality. Japan itself had tried to build true strategic bombers. The Nakajima G5N, designed in 1941, was supposed to reach targets 2,500 miles away while carrying 3 tons of bombs. The prototype achieved barely half that range with a fraction of the payload, all while being so unstable that test pilots refused to fly it above 10,000 feet. The project was cancelled after 2 aircraft were built, neither of which saw combat. The Tachikawa Ki-74, another attempt at a strategic heavy bomber, never made it past the mock-up stage. Engineers concluded that building an aircraft capable of reaching America from Japanese bases would require engines, materials, and manufacturing precision that simply didn't exist in Japanese industry. If Japan, with its advanced aeronautical engineering and experienced design teams, couldn't build a true strategic bomber, surely the Americans faced the same limitations. Preparing and narrating, this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Japanese planners failed to grasp was that American aircraft design philosophy operated from entirely different premises. While Japanese engineers asked, "What can we remove to make this fly farther?" American engineers asked, "What do we need to add to make this fly farther and survive?" The difference between subtraction and addition, between compromise and capability, would prove to be the difference between defeat and victory. First Lieutenant Shoichi Watanabe, an engineering officer at the Army Aviation Technology Research Institute, had been among the first to seriously challenge the assumption of American limitations. In a report filed in June 1942, he had written something that got him quietly reassigned to a backwater testing facility. "We assume American engineering faces the same constraints as ours. This assumption is dangerous. Their industrial capacity, precision manufacturing, and materials science may operate at levels we don't comprehend. We should prepare for the possibility that they will solve problems we consider unsolvable." His report had been filed away and forgotten. Now, 30 months later, the proof that he'd been right sat on Omura's tarmac, its 4 massive engines silent but somehow still radiating power. The captured giant arrived without ceremony or warning. One day the field was normal. The next, Soviet trucks were unloading crates marked with Cyrillic characters that meant nothing to Japanese personnel. Then came the wings, the fuselage sections, the engines, all transported through the back channels of an alliance that neither Moscow nor Tokyo officially acknowledged existed. The reassembly took 3 weeks. Soviet technicians supervised, communicating through translators, their faces carefully neutral as Japanese engineers studied every rivet, every system, every component of the aircraft that would destroy their cities. By late November, the B-29 was whole again. Damaged sections had been repaired using Japanese materials that looked crude next to American precision manufacturing. The bomb bay was empty. Most ammunition had been removed, but the core systems, the engines, the fuel tanks, the instruments, all were functional. Captain Tomita had been selected to lead the test program based on his experience with large aircraft and his reputation for analytical precision. Standing beside the B-29 for the first time, he had tried to maintain professional detachment, but certain details penetrated his composure like bullets through armor plate. The landing gear struts were thicker than his torso. The main tires stood chest high. Each propeller blade was taller than a man and machined from a single piece of aluminum alloy that Japan couldn't produce in such sizes. The cockpit sat 15 feet above the ground, requiring a ladder to access, but it was the skin of the aircraft that truly unsettled him. He had expected something like Japanese bombers, thin aluminum carefully formed and joined. Instead, the B-29's fuselage felt solid under his hand, panels thick enough to resist small arms fire. He rapped his knuckles against a section. Instead of a hollow metallic ring, he heard a solid thunk. This wasn't an aircraft built to minimize weight. This was an aircraft built to absorb punishment and keep flying. Major Hideaki Kano, chief engineer for the inspection team, pointed out details with growing disbelief. Notice the fuel tank construction, not rubber coating like our designs. Actual multiple-layer self-sealing cells. A bullet punctures the outer skin, inner layers swell and seal the hole automatically. American pilots fly home with tanks that look like Swiss cheese but haven't lost a drop of fuel. He gestured to the defensive armament. 12 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, not 7.7 mm, not even 13 mm, 50 caliber. Fired by remote-controlled turrets using a central fire control system. The gunner doesn't sit at his gun. He sits at a computing site that calculates lead and deflection automatically. One man can control an entire turret system. Tomita climbed the ladder into the cockpit and stopped at the threshold, simply staring. He had expected something like a Japanese bomber's cramped Spartan flight deck. Instead, he found a workspace that seemed impossibly spacious. The pilot and co-pilot sat in seats that looked more comfortable than his chair at home. Between them, a panel of instruments gleamed with a complexity that suggested capabilities he hadn't imagined. Altimeter, airspeed, engine gauges for 4 massive power plants, navigation equipment, radio systems. Every dial precisely marked, every switch labelled in English he couldn't read, but whose organization spoke of systematic thought. The flight engineer's station behind the pilots contained more instruments than the entire cockpit of a Japanese bomber. 4 complete engine monitoring panels, fuel management systems, electrical systems, hydraulic pressure gauges, everything needed to manage the complex machinery of 4 18-cylinder radial engines producing 2,200 horsepower each. But what stopped Tomita's breath was the space between the cockpit and the rear of the aircraft. A padded tunnel, pressurized, ran the entire length of the fuselage. Crew could move from the cockpit to the tail without ever exposing themselves to the killing cold of high altitude. In Japanese bombers, crew positions were isolated. Wounded gunners died alone. Jammed equipment stayed jammed. The B-29's crew could move, communicate, assist each other, all while flying 6 miles above the earth in comfort impossible in Japanese designs. Major Kano climbed up beside him, his face carefully composed but his voice betraying shock. The Americans pressurized the crew compartments. The entire cockpit and gunner stations are sealed and pressurized to simulated 8,000-foot altitude. Even when flying at 30,000 feet, their crews wear light flight suits, not heavy heated gear. They breathe normally while our pilots are sucking oxygen through masks and struggling with frostbite. He pulled out a technical manual they'd found in the aircraft. This is the pilot's handbook, 347 pages. Our longest bomber manual is 80 pages. This covers startup procedures, emergency protocols, systems management, performance tables, all written for average pilots. They've standardized everything so thoroughly that they can train crew in months to operate this machine. Tomita flipped through the manual, unable to read the English but understanding the implications of its thickness, its organization, its obvious assumption that every detail would be documented. "How many do they have?" he asked quietly. Kano consulted. "Intelligence reports." "Our best estimate is they're producing roughly 150 per month. They have at least 3 major assembly facilities: Wichita, Kansas, Renton, Washington, Marietta, Georgia. Each running 3 shifts, 7 days per week. By the time we finish testing this one aircraft, they'll have built 600 more." The numbers hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Japan's entire bomber production, all types, all manufacturers, had peaked at 330 aircraft per month in early 1944 and was now declining toward 200 per month as resources dried up. The Americans were building more of this one bomber type than Japan built aircraft of all types combined. And every single B-29 represented a quantum leap in capability over anything Japan could produce. Captain Tomita sat in the pilot's seat, his hands resting on a control yoke that felt solid and precisely weighted. Through the windscreen, he could see across Omura's field to where Japanese bombers sat in their revetments. From this elevated perspective, they looked like children's toys, fragile, outdated, pathetically inadequate. He thought about Lieutenant Watanabe's forgotten report from 1942. The man had tried to warn them. American engineering might operate at levels we don't comprehend. Now, sitting in the cockpit of their comprehension-defying achievement, Tomita understood that this was more than an aircraft. This was proof of a civilization's power. This was industrial capacity made tangible. This was the future sitting on a Japanese airfield, and the future belonged entirely to the enemy. Major Kano stood behind him, also silent. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't compromise. They don't choose between range and payload and protection. They engineer solutions to have everything. That's the difference. We work within constraints. They eliminate constraints." Tomita nodded slowly, still, staring through the windscreen at Japanese bombers that suddenly seemed to belong to a different era. "When do we fly it?" he asked. 3 days. We need to familiarize the crew with systems, translate enough of the manual to understand procedures, and brief everyone on what to expect. Kano paused. "Captain, I've reviewed every specification. The performance figures seem impossible. If they're accurate, this aircraft will demonstrate capabilities that invalidate everything we thought we knew about strategic bombing. And if they're not accurate, then America has filled this aircraft with instruments that lie, manuals that deceive, and systems designed to fool us. But the engineering suggests otherwise. Everything is overbuilt, overspecified, overcapable. This machine was designed by people who could afford to add rather than subtract. And that terrifies me more than the specifications." 3 days later, under grey December skies, Captain Tomita would climb back into that cockpit with a crew of Japan's best pilots and engineers. He would start those massive engines and feel power unlike anything in Japanese aviation, and he would understand, with the clarity of mathematics and the finality of physics, exactly why Japan was losing the war. The B-29 wouldn't just be an aircraft he flew, it would be a theorem he proved, one that demonstrated with precision why courage and skill and sacrifice meant nothing against the industrial capacity of an enemy that could build such machines by the hundreds, while Japan struggled to keep dozens flying. But that revelation awaited him 3 days in the future. For now, he sat in the cockpit of American power, his hands on controls designed for a different kind of warfare, and tried to comprehend what it meant that the enemy could afford to lose this aircraft and could simply write it off as an acceptable loss, while Japan had mobilized its best personnel and resources just to study the single example they possessed. December 1st, 1944. Dawn broke cold over Omura as Captain Tomita completed his pre-flight walk-around of the B-29, his breath misting in frigid air. 3 days of intensive study had familiarized the crew with basic systems, but translating the thick technical manual remained incomplete. They would fly this mission understanding perhaps 60% of the aircraft's capabilities, operating systems through trial and observation rather than complete knowledge. It felt like flying blind while pretending to see. The crew assembled beneath the massive bomber represented the finest talent Japanese aviation could spare. First Lieutenant Masao Itagaki, co-pilot, had logged 3,000 hours in multi-engine aircraft and possessed an engineer's mind for systems analysis. Flight Engineer Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura had spent 15 years maintaining every bomber type in Japanese service and could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Navigator Lieutenant Susumu Yamada had plotted courses across the Pacific since 1937 and could calculate fuel consumption in his head with accuracy that shamed slide rules. 3 additional engineers, 2 interpreters fluent in technical English, and a photographer to document every detail rounded out the test crew. They climbed aboard through the forward hatch, each man stopping to absorb the strangeness of American design philosophy made manifest. Sergeant Nakamura ran his hands over the flight engineer's panel with something approaching reverence. Everything is labeled, every switch, every gauge, every circuit breaker. They assume the operator might not memorize everything, so they mark it permanently. We expect crews to know by position and memory. They engineer for human limitations. Lieutenant Yamada settled into the navigator's station and immediately understood he was looking at capabilities that redefined his profession. They have a radar system for navigation, ground mapping, a radar that shows terrain below through clouds and darkness. Our navigators use stars, landmarks, dead reckoning. Their navigators have electronic eyes that see through weather. He studied the radar scope, currently dark, trying to imagine what it revealed when operational. Flying with instruments that could pierce clouds and night would transform strategic bombing from a weather-dependent gamble to an all-weather certainty. Captain Tomita took the left seat, Itagaki the right. Together they worked through the startup checklist, a document 23 pages long for procedures Japanese pilots completed in 5 minutes through memorized routine. But the B-29 demanded systematic process. Each of 4 engines required specific sequence: fuel booster pumps, battery power, generator checks, hydraulic pressure verification. The checklist assumed nothing, forgot nothing, left nothing to chance or memory. Engine 1, ready to start, Tomita called. Nakamura confirmed from his panel. Fuel pressure normal, mixture rich, ignition switch is on. Tomita pressed the starter. The massive Wright R3350 duplex cyclone engine, 18 cylinders in 2 rows, groaned into motion. The propeller blades swung through compression strokes, each rotation building momentum. Then ignition caught and the engine erupted into thunder that shook the airframe. Tomita watched the tachometer climb to idle speed, 1,200 revolutions per minute, feeling power transmitted through the controls like electricity through wire. They started engines 2, 3, and 4 in sequence. With all 4 running, the B-29 sat on the tarmac generating 8,800 horsepower, more than 3 times the power of Japan's largest operational bomber. The noise inside the cockpit, even with the pressurization system creating some sound insulation, made speech impossible without the intercom system. But it wasn't harsh noise. It was smooth, synchronized, purposeful. Thunder that spoke of precision engineering and unlimited resources. Tomita advanced the throttles slightly, testing engine response. All 4 answered instantly, power building smoothly without the surging or roughness common in Japanese radial engines. The right engines had been built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, assembled by workers who had made thousands of identical engines operated by systems designed to prevent the overheating and mechanical failures that plagued Japanese power plants. Even sitting still, the B-29 demonstrated reliability that Japanese engines achieved only after extensive hand-tuning by expert mechanics. "Tower clears us for taxi," Itagaki relayed through the intercom. Tomita released the brakes and felt the massive bomber begin to roll. The tricycle landing gear, another American innovation, made ground handling effortless compared to the tail-dragging configuration of Japanese bombers. He could see directly ahead instead of weaving to glimpse around a nose pointed skyward. The steerable nose wheel responded precisely to rudder pedals. The B-29 moved across the tarmac with the dignity of its size, but the obedience of something far smaller. At the runway threshold, Tomita ran through final checks, control surfaces free and operating, flaps set to 20 degrees for takeoff, trim tabs adjusted, each engine generating 50 inches of manifold pressure at 2,500 revolutions per minute. Everything indicated readiness for an operation that still seemed improbable. This aircraft weighed 63,000 pounds empty, over 100,000 pounds at combat weight. Japanese bombers weighed half that. Physics suggested something this heavy shouldn't fly with any grace or efficiency. "Ready for takeoff," he announced. He advanced all 4 throttles smoothly forward to their stops. The engine's roar deepened into a sustained bellow of maximum power. The B-29 accelerated down the runway, slow at first, ponderous, building speed gradually. 50 miles per hour, 70, 90. The tail came up naturally with the tricycle gear. 100 miles per hour. Tomita eased back on the yoke and felt the massive bomber transition from ground to air without drama, without struggle, simply lifting itself into its natural element with power to spare. They climbed through 3,000 feet before Tomita truly believed what was happening. The B-29 flew. It flew well. It flew with stability and responsiveness that contradicted everything he thought he knew about aircraft scaling. The controls felt crisp and positive. The engines ran smoothly at climb power, temperatures and pressures locked in normal ranges. The aircraft trimmed easily to hands-off flight, requiring minimal control input to maintain attitude. At 8,000 feet, the cockpit pressurization system activated automatically. Tomita felt his ears pop as internal pressure stabilized. The change was subtle but profound. Instead of tightening oxygen masks and preparing for the thin, cold air of altitude, the crew simply continued working in shirt-sleeve comfort. American crews could fly 6-hour missions at 30,000 feet without the fatigue, hypoxia risks, and cold injuries that devastated Japanese bomber crews on long missions. Level at 10,000 feet, Tomita announced, beginning performance testing. For the next 4 hours, they methodically explored what the B-29 could do. They tested climb rates at various weights and altitudes. They measured fuel consumption at different power settings. They evaluated handling characteristics through turns, descents, and simulated combat maneuvers. And with each test, the impossible became merely improbable, then simply factual. At 15,000 feet, maintaining 220 miles per hour on 60% power, Lieutenant Yamada called out fuel consumption figures. "At current settings, we're burning 280 gallons per hour total. Fuel capacity is 6,982 gallons. That gives us approximately 24 hours endurance, accounting for reserves." He paused, recalculating to verify the absurd number. Combat radius exceeds 2,000 miles. Ferry range could approach 6,000 miles. The numbers silenced the intercom. 2,000 miles combat radius meant the B-29 could strike any target in Japan from bases in the Marianas and return safely. 6,000 miles ferry range meant they could fly from California to Hawaii without refueling. Japanese bombers achieved 1,300 miles combat radius by stripping every non-essential system and accepting casualties from mechanical failure and enemy action. The B-29 achieved 50% greater range while carrying twice the payload, 3 times the defensive armament, and crew protection that Japanese designs couldn't match. Tomita pushed the B-29 higher, climbing, toward altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled for oxygen and Japanese bombers couldn't maintain formation. At 25,000 feet, the engines still produced smooth power. At 28,000 feet, performance remained solid. At 30,000 feet, 6 miles above the Earth, the B-29 cruised at 230 miles per hour, as if altitude meant nothing. Service ceiling is listed as 33,600 feet, Itagaki read from the translated specifications. At that altitude, our best interceptor, the Ki-61 Tony, can barely maintain level flight and has almost no maneuverability. The J-2M Raiden can reach it but arrives with maybe 5 minutes of combat time before fuel exhaustion forces descent. The Ki-84 Frank, our newest fighter, might intercept effectively, but we've built fewer than 400 of them. Sergeant Nakamura added cold mathematics from the engineering perspective. Our bombers operate at 18 to 22,000 feet maximum. At that altitude, they're vulnerable to every fighter we or the Americans fly. The B-29 operates above effective interception range and can cruise there for hours. They've engineered themselves out of the battle entirely. Tomita tested the defensive armament's range of motion, watching the remote turrets traverse smoothly through their arcs. The central fire control system, even with its computing site damaged and partially inoperative, demonstrated sophistication that Japanese aircraft designers had never attempted. Each gun position could be controlled remotely from multiple stations. Gunners aimed through optical sights that automatically calculated target lead based on range, speed, and deflection. The system assumed that human reflexes were too slow, human calculations too imprecise, so it engineered electronic solutions to human limitations. Our fighters attack from astern because that's where bombers are weakest, Lieutenant Itagaki observed. The B-29 mounts 450 caliber machine guns in the tail, all controlled by one gunner through a computing site. Our pilots will dive in expecting 1 or 2 rifles caliber guns fired by someone barely able to aim through his frozen oxygen mask. Instead, they'll face massed 50 caliber fire directed by a comfortable operator aided by mechanical computation. Our tactics are designed for bombers that don't exist anymore. They flew a simulated bomb run, and Lieutenant Yamada used the Norden bomb site to demonstrate precision that redefined strategic bombing. The site computes target approach automatically. The bombardier makes minor corrections, but the device calculates wind drift, airspeed, altitude, everything. It even controls the aircraft during the final run, flying more precisely than any pilot. Our bombardiers use optical sights and hand calculations. We bomb from lower altitude and still miss by hundreds of yards. They bomb from 6 miles up and hit, within 50 yards of aim point. The hours passed as they pushed the B-29 through every test they could devise with limited fuel and the need to return before dark. Each test revealed capability that exceeded Japanese equivalents by margins that seemed designed to demoralize. The aircraft that intelligence had dismissed as propaganda, that seemed too capable to be real, proved conservative in its specifications. Every system worked as designed or better. Nothing failed. Nothing overheated. Nothing required the constant nursing and adjustment that kept Japanese bombers flying. As they descended toward Omura in late afternoon light, Tomita felt something he'd never experienced in 2 decades of military aviation. Not fear, though that would have been rational. Not anger, though he had right to it. What he felt was comprehension of defeat made manifest in aluminum and steel. The B-29 wasn't just superior to Japanese bombers. It operated in a different category, entirely, defined by engineering philosophy and industrial capacity that Japan couldn't match regardless of courage or sacrifice. He thought about Japanese factories struggling to build bombers that were obsolete before they left the assembly line. He thought about crews flying without pressurization, without computing fire control, without self-sealing tanks or adequate armor. He thought about the strategic assumption that American bombers couldn't reach Japan, an assumption now revealed as catastrophically wrong. And he thought about the B-29 production rate, 150 per month, with 3 factories running 3 shifts each. "How many Japanese cities are there?" he asked quietly over the intercom. Navigator Yamada understood the question immediately. "Major cities with populations over 100,000? 63. including Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Kyoto. Add mid-sized industrial cities, and you're over 200 targets. And if each B-29 carries 10 tons of incendiary bombs? If they come at 30,000 feet where we can't intercept effectively? If they come by the hundreds? No one answered because the mathematics answered itself. At 150 B-29s produced per month, America could assemble a force of over 1,000 within a year. 1,000 bombers, each carrying 10 tons, operating from bases in the Marianas. 10,000 tons of bombs per raid. Raids could be repeated every few days because the B-29's reliability and ease of maintenance allowed quick turnaround. Within months, every Japanese city could be systematically destroyed by attacks launched from beyond the reach of effective defense. The landing at Omura was smooth, the B-29 settling onto the runway with the stability of its size and the precision of its design. Tomita taxied to the revetment area where staff officers and engineers waited to debrief the crew on everything they'd learned. He shut down the engines in sequence, watching each massive power plant wind down to stillness, and tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent for the report he'd need to write. Major Kano met them as they climbed down from the aircraft. His face held the careful neutrality of someone preparing to hear confirmation of something he already suspected. Well? Tomita looked up at the B-29, at its massive wings and powerful engines and sophisticated systems. Everything works. Everything they claimed is accurate or understated. This aircraft can reach any target in Japan, from Saipan or Tinian, bomb with precision from altitudes we can't defend, and return safely. And they're building 150 per month. Can we develop countermeasures? Improved fighters? Better tactics? Concentrated defenses? We can try. But the margins are too large. This isn't a slightly better bomber. This is a complete redefinition of strategic air power. They've engineered solutions to problems we're still trying to understand. Even if we built fighters capable of intercepting at 30,000 feet, even if we developed tactics to counter their defenses, they'd simply build more B-29s faster than we could build interceptors. The gathered officers absorbed this in silence. Then one spoke, a colonel from the Army Aviation Bureau whose name Tomita didn't catch. Your report will state this clearly. The implications must be presented to the General Staff. My report will state what we observed. A single B-29 represents more capability than a squadron of our best bombers. They lose one to mechanical failure or accident and simply build two more to replace it. We lose one squadron and struggle to rebuild for months. This isn't about individual aircraft performance anymore. This is about industrial systems, about an economy that can produce precision machinery in quantities that overwhelm any defense. Major Kano dismissed the other officers, leaving only the test crew. When they were alone, he spoke with the bluntness of someone past caring about military protocols. 3 weeks ago, B-29s bombed Tokyo for the first time. High-altitude precision attacks on aircraft factories. Our fighters intercepted perhaps 10% of the raid. Our anti-aircraft fire claimed 3 bombers confirmed, maybe 5. But over 70 B-29s reached their targets and bombed accurately from altitudes our defenses barely reached. He pulled out reconnaissance photographs showing damaged factories. This was their first attempt. They're still learning optimal tactics, still establishing bases in the Marianas, still building up their forces. In 3 months, maybe 6, they'll have enough B-29s to attack in overwhelming numbers, and we'll have no answer except to watch our cities burn. Sergeant Nakamura, who had been silent throughout the debriefing, finally spoke. I've maintained bombers since 1930. I've kept Nells flying with parts cannibalized from wrecks. I've rebuilt Bettys after they should have been scrapped. I've made miracles happen with wire, solder, and desperation. But I can't fix this. No mechanic can, no pilot, no engineer, no amount of courage changes the mathematics. We're trying to fight an industrial democracy with handicraft manufacturing. It's already over. We just haven't admitted it yet. The words hung in the cold December air, like an epitaph, for an empire that had convinced itself that spirit could overcome material, that warrior virtue could defeat industrial capacity, that willpower mattered more than engineering capability. The B-29, sitting silently on Omura's tarmac, proved otherwise with the finality of physical law. Captain Tomita looked at his crew, at the officers, at the captured American bomber that had revealed more through one test flight than 1,000 intelligence reports. "We'll write the technical report. We'll document the performance, data, the system's analysis, everything we observed. But the real report, the one that matters, can be written in one sentence. They can afford to lose this aircraft, and we can't afford to capture another one. That disparity tells you everything about how this war ends." He walked away from the B-29, away from the officers, toward the operations building where his detailed report awaited writing. Behind him, the captured bomber sat in gathering darkness, a monument to American industrial might and Japanese delusion. Within weeks, B-29s would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese cities, proving that every assumption about American limitations had been catastrophically wrong. The test flight had revealed mathematical certainty of defeat. The fire raids would make that mathematics burn. December 10th, 1944, Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. Captain Tomita's technical report landed on desks throughout Japan's military leadership like an incendiary bomb nobody wanted to acknowledge was burning. The document ran to 147 pages of detailed analysis, performance data, systems evaluation, and strategic implications. But most officers never made it past page 3, where Tomita had written in precise technical language what amounted to a death certificate for Japanese strategic defense. The report should have triggered immediate strategic reassessment. Instead, it disappeared into bureaucratic machinery designed to filter uncomfortable truths into manageable fictions. Colonel Seizaburo Endo, Army Aviation Bureau Chief of Aircraft Evaluation, wrote a cover memo that transformed Tomita's findings from crisis to curiosity. While the captured B-29 demonstrates impressive range and altitude capability, these advantages are offset by the aircraft's size, complexity, and vulnerability to determined fighter attack. Recommendations: accelerate high-altitude interceptor development and improve radar-directed anti-aircraft defenses. The memo ignored Tomita's central finding, that Japan lacked the industrial capacity, pilot training infrastructure, and time to develop effective countermeasures against an opponent producing 150 B-29s monthly. That determined fighter attack meant nothing if fighters couldn't reach operational altitude with enough fuel to engage. That radar-directed defenses required radar systems Japan didn't possess and couldn't manufacture in necessary quantities. The memo transformed mathematical certainty of defeat into bureaucratic suggestion for marginal improvement. But reality doesn't negotiate with bureaucracy. While staff officers filed reports and wrote memos, American forces captured Saipan in July 1944, then Tinian, then Guam. Engineers immediately began constructing airbases designed specifically for B-29 operations. Runways extending 8,500 feet, longer than any Japanese runway. Hard stands for hundreds of bombers. Fuel storage for millions of gallons of aviation gasoline. Maintenance facilities equipped with tools and parts for an invasion force of superfortresses. By November 19, 1944, exactly 8 days before Captain Tomita first climbed into the captured B-29 at Omura, 111 B-29s from the 7-3 bombardment wing launched the first raid against Tokyo from Saipan bases. They struck the Nakajima aircraft factory at Musashino in daylight precision attack from 30,000 feet. Japanese fighters scrambled desperately to intercept, climbing toward targets flying higher and faster than defensive doctrine anticipated. Lieutenant Shigeo Nishimura, flying a Ki-61 Tony interceptor, described the helplessness in his after-action report. "We climbed at maximum power for 40 minutes to reach 28,000 feet. The B-29s were at 32,000, appearing and disappearing in cloud layers. When we finally reached attack altitude, our engines were overheating, our airspeed barely 180 miles per hour. The bombers cruised past at over 230. By the time we positioned for attack, We had fuel for perhaps one pass before mandatory descent. I fired at extreme range, observed no hits, dove away before their gunners could track me properly. The raid damaged the Musashino factory but didn't destroy it. High-altitude precision bombing from 6 miles up proved less accurate than American planners hoped. But that first raid wasn't about destruction. It was announcement. The message wasn't subtle. We can reach you now. We can reach you whenever we choose, and you cannot stop us. January 9th, 1945. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commanding 21st Bomber Command, was relieved of duty and replaced by Major General Curtis LeMay, a commander whose reputation for ruthless effectiveness preceded him like smoke before fire. LeMay studied the results of high-altitude precision raids and reached a conclusion that would transform the strategic bombing campaign and consume Japanese cities in firestorms that made conventional warfare seem merciful by comparison. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working effectively against Japanese industry. Cloud cover obscured targets. Jet stream winds at altitude, a meteorological phenomenon barely understood in 1945, pushed bombs miles off target. The B-29's sophisticated Norden bombsight couldn't compensate for 200-mile-per-hour winds at 30,000 feet. Accuracy degraded to the point where hitting a specific factory became statistical luck rather than targeting skill. But LeMay recognized something that high-altitude doctrine missed. Japanese cities weren't just targets. They were fuel. Wood and paper construction, narrow streets, dense population, cottage industries distributed throughout residential areas. The cities themselves were weapons waiting to be used against their inhabitants. You didn't need to hit specific factories with precision when you could burn entire neighborhoods and destroy the small workshops, assembly facilities, and worker housing that sustained Japanese war production. On March 9, 1945, LeMay launched the first full-scale incendiary raid against Tokyo. 334 B-29s carrying M69 incendiary cluster bombs, each aircraft loaded with 7 tons of fire rather than high explosive. They attacked at night, from low altitude between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, in stream formation rather than tight defensive boxes. The tactics violated every principle of B-29 employment. They threw away the aircraft's altitude advantage, exposed bombers to anti-aircraft fire, eliminated defensive formation. But LeMay understood that against Japanese city construction and overwhelmed defenses, the risks were acceptable. 1,877 civilians died that night. 41,000 were injured. Over 1 million became homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned completely, creating firestorms that generated their own weather systems, winds that tore roofs from buildings and sucked people into flames. The heat was so intense that water in canals boiled, metal melted, stone cracked. People who jumped into rivers for safety found the water itself on fire from burning oil and debris. Lieutenant Colonel Masaharu Kawamura, Air Defense Coordinator for Tokyo Metropolitan District, watched from his headquarters as the city transformed into hell made visible. His report, written in the stunned language of someone trying to describe the indescribable, captured the totality of helplessness. Our fighters scrambled but encountered B-29s across 40 miles of approach paths. They attacked individually, without coordination, their radios jammed or overwhelmed by hundreds of aircraft, transmissions. Our anti-aircraft batteries fired until ammunition exhausted, then fell silent while bombers continued overhead for hours. The fires created thermal currents that lifted the B-29s, making them bounce and shimmy through turbulence born of the destruction they'd created. By dawn, Tokyo had ceased to exist as a functional city. Only isolated neighborhoods remained intact, islands in an ocean of ash. The Omura test crew learned about Tokyo's destruction through official reports sanitized of emotional content but devastating in their mathematics. 16 square miles destroyed by 334 bombers in one night. Japan had 63 major cities. The Americans could repeat this attack every few days, systematically working through the target list with industrial efficiency. The B-29 they'd tested had demonstrated capability. The Tokyo raid demonstrated intent. Captain Tomita requested and received permission to fly the captured B-29 on a second test flight, this time with modified objectives. He wanted to understand not just what the aircraft could do, but what American crews experienced during the missions that were consuming Japanese cities. On March 21, 1945, he and his crew took off from Omura and flew a simulated low-altitude night strike profile against a hypothetical target. They flew at 7,000 feet, the altitude LeMay's bombers used over Tokyo. They flew at night, navigating by dead reckoning and basic instruments. They flew for 6 hours, simulating the flight time from Saipan to Tokyo and return. And they understood, with the clarity that comes from experience rather than theory, exactly what American crews faced on these missions, and exactly why Japanese defenses failed to stop them. The B-29 at low altitude flies faster than our fighters can pursue for extended periods, Lieutenant Itagaki noted during the flight. They cruise at 250 miles per hour, indicated at 7,000 feet. Our key 43 Oscar interceptors maintain maybe 230 at that altitude, and only for short periods before engine overheating forces them to throttle back. The Americans don't dogfight. They don't need to. They simply fly their mission profile, and anything that can't keep pace is irrelevant. Sergeant Nakamura monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption with the attention of someone calculating survival margins. At low altitude, fuel consumption increases substantially, but their fuel capacity compensates. They're burning 400 gallons per hour at cruise power, but they're still completing the mission with fuel reserves. We'd plan this flight down to the last gallon and arrive home with dry tanks. They plan for contingency, for mechanical issues, for diversions. They engineer margin into everything. The night flight revealed another crucial advantage. Japanese cities weren't blacked out effectively, because blackout discipline required coordination, enforcement, and alternative lighting that overtaxed civil defense systems. From 7,000 feet, even minimal light pollution created navigational reference points. Rivers reflected moonlight. Rail lines created darker patterns through landscape. Cities appeared as subtle variations in darkness that trained navigators identified easily. The B-29's radar could map terrain features through clouds. Japanese defenders fought blind while American crews navigated with electronic eyes. When they landed at dawn after the 6-hour simulated mission, Tomita wrote a supplemental report that never reached higher headquarters because by late March 1945, nobody wanted reports explaining why the war was lost. They wanted reports suggesting how to continue fighting, but Tomita wrote it anyway, for history, if not for policy. The B-29 isn't merely superior to Japanese bombers in performance. It represents a complete system of strategic warfare that Japan cannot counter with available resources. The aircraft itself is one component, the bases capable of supporting operations, the fuel supply chain, the maintenance infrastructure, the trained crews, the targeting intelligence, the industrial capacity to replace losses. All of these combine into offensive capability that overwhelms defense, regardless of defender courage or skill. He concluded with words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We tested one B-29. America operates over 1,000. We studied its capabilities in controlled conditions. America employs those capabilities against our cities every night. We wrote reports. America writes obituaries for our citizens by the tens of thousands. The disparity between analysis and action, between understanding and response, defines why we are losing this war. April 12, 1945. President Franklin Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman assumed office, inheriting a strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying Japanese urban infrastructure. Between March and July, LeMay's 21st Bomber Command flew 66 major raids against Japanese cities: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, Kawasaki, each burned in turn. The B-29s dropped 165,000 tons of incendiaries and high explosives, destroyed 178 square miles of urban area, killed over 400,000 civilians, injured more than 1 million, left 8 million homeless. The captured B-29 at Omura became a teaching tool, a museum piece showcasing enemy capability to pilots who would never encounter it in combat because Japan no longer had fuel to fly regular missions. Student pilots walked through its pressurized fuselage, sat in its comfortable crew stations, studied its complex systems, and they understood, with the bitterness of knowledge acquired too late, that they'd been prepared to fight a different war against a different enemy with different capabilities. Lieutenant Yoshio Shimada, a student pilot receiving his final training before assignment to Homeland Defense units that existed primarily on paper, toured the captured B-29 in June 1945. His diary entry captured the psychological impact. "I have trained for 2 years to fly the Ki-44 Tojo interceptor. I can perform every aerobatic maneuver. I know my aircraft's capabilities intimately, but standing inside the B-29, I understand that my training prepared me to be heroic in an obsolete way. The Americans don't need to outfly us. They've out-engineered the requirement for aerial combat entirely. They fly higher, faster, farther, with crews more comfortable and protected than we are on the ground. What courage means against such disparity, I cannot say." August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay, a B-29 from the 509 Composite Group, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar, another B-29, dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The weapon was different, but the delivery system was the same aircraft that Captain Tomita had flown 9 months earlier. The B-29 that had demonstrated conventional strategic bombing capability had now demonstrated the capacity to deliver weapons that made conventional bombing obsolete. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Among the many factors that led to surrender, the systematic destruction of Japanese cities by B-29 raids ranked prominently. The atomic bombs ended the war, but the conventional firebombing campaign had already destroyed Japan's capacity to sustain industrial warfare. The B-29 had proven exactly what the captured aircraft at Omura had demonstrated. That strategic bombing had evolved beyond interception, beyond defense, into a form of warfare that industrial capacity determined and geography couldn't prevent. The captured B-29 remained at Omura until American occupation forces arrived in September 1945. Captain Tomita, Major Kano, and the test crew supervised its turnover to United States Army Air Forces personnel, answering questions about the testing program and the aircraft's condition. An American technical intelligence officer, examining the maintenance logs kept in meticulous Japanese, expressed surprise at how well the aircraft had been preserved. "You could have sabotaged systems, stripped parts, learned everything, and destroyed the evidence," the officer said through an interpreter. "Instead, you maintained it better than some of our own units." Major Kano responded with the tired honesty of someone past maintaining useful fictions. "We maintained it because understanding our enemy was more important than petty sabotage. We learned exactly how far behind we'd fallen. That knowledge didn't change the war's outcome, but it prevented us from dying in ignorance. Sometimes understanding defeat is its own form of victory." The American officer looked at the B-29, at the Japanese engineers and pilots gathered around it, at the maintenance logs documenting every test flight and systems evaluation. "What did you learn?" he asked. Captain Tomita answered, "That you didn't win because your pilots were braver, that you didn't win because your tactics were superior. You won because your society could afford to build machines like this by the thousands while protecting the men inside them. You engineered away the need for sacrifice by spending resources we couldn't match. That's not criticism. That's recognition of a different philosophy of warfare. We believed spirit could overcome material. You proved that sufficient material makes spirit irrelevant." He gestured to the B-29. "This aircraft taught us that modern war isn't about warriors. It's about systems, logistics, industrial capacity, engineering sophistication, all the things we neglected while perfecting the sword. When we laughed at early reports of its specifications, we were laughing at our own ignorance. By the time we stopped laughing, our cities were burning." The captured B-29 was eventually scrapped, its components catalogued and studied, its lessons absorbed into technical intelligence reports that documented Japanese aviation capabilities and limitations. But the real lesson, the one that mattered beyond technical specifications and performance data, was simpler and more profound. That wars are won not by the courage of individual warriors, but by the capacity of societies to build, sustain, and employ systems of warfare that courage alone cannot defeat. Captain Tomita returned to civilian life, eventually becoming an aviation engineer and consultant. He never flew again after the war, choosing instead to teach aeronautical engineering at universities, where he emphasized systems thinking, reliability design, and the integration of human factors into aircraft development. When asked about his wartime experience, he often returned to that first test flight in the captured B-29, to the moment when he understood with absolute clarity that Japan had lost a war it never had the capacity to win. "We flew one captured bomber and learned we were defeated," he would tell students. "The Americans flew 1,000 operational bombers and demonstrated how thoroughly they'd won." The difference between those numbers explains everything about industrial warfare in the 20th century. Build better warriors or build better systems. Only one strategy survives contact with modern reality. We chose wrong. The B-29 proved it, and 67 Japanese cities burned to teach us a lesson we learned too late to matter. The story of the captured B-29 isn't a story of espionage success or technical intelligence triumph. It's a story of recognition, of the moment when understanding arrives too late to change outcomes, but early enough to comprehend exactly why defeat was inevitable. In that cockpit over Kyushu, Captain Tomita and his crew flew into the future and recognized they were living in the past. The B-29 didn't just outperform Japanese bombers. It operated in a different era of warfare entirely, one where industrial capacity mattered more than warrior spirit, where engineering sophistication defeated tactical excellence, where the ability to protect your warriors proved more valuable than the willingness to sacrifice them. Japan had brought swords to a machine-age fight, and wondered why courage meant nothing against the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority. The captured B-29 answered that question with the finality of mathematics and the certainty of physical law, and the answer burned across 67 cities, before anyone in power was willing to acknowledge what one test flight had proven 9 months before the end. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.